everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty complex topic: how society is trying to balance individual religious freedom with a government that's officially neutral when it comes to matters of faith.
Sounds like a tough one.
It is. But to help us unpack all of this, we've got some really interesting excerpts. We've got some that lay out the core ideas, some that present arguments against neutrality, a peek into how this all plays out in church-state relations, and we even get a global tour of different approaches from around the world.
Wow, a global tour. Sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. You might be thinking, is this going to be some boring civics lesson? But trust me, this is going to be anything but boring. We're going way beyond just definitions.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
We're going to uncover why this topic sparks so much debate, and I think you'll be surprised by how many different ways countries try to solve this puzzle. It's not easy.
I bet. So what makes this such a tricky issue in the first place? Why is it so hard to find that balance?
Well, it gets right to the heart of individual freedom and the role of government. Can a government really be completely hands-off when it comes to faith, especially as societies become more and more diverse?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
And if not, what impact does that have on everyone, religious or not?
Yeah, those are questions with no easy answers, which makes exploring them all the more interesting, right?
Absolutely. So let's start with those core ideas: religious freedom and secular governance. Our sources point to the U.S. First Amendment as like a prime example of trying to make those two things work together.
Right. The First Amendment, it's this constant balancing act. On the one hand, it prevents the government from establishing an official religion, but it also protects the right of individuals to freely practice their faith. So you can see how that leads to a lot of debate about what neutrality really means.
So is the U.S. actually neutral? Our sources mention different types of secularism, political versus philosophical. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. Political secularism is more about recognizing that religion is a part of society, but the government shouldn't favor any one faith over another.
Okay.
Now, that was more in line with what the U.S. founders intended, but then there's philosophical secularism, which is much more strict.
How so?
It's almost like trying to make a shared disbelief the foundation of government, like trying to eliminate religion from the public sphere entirely. The, the U.S. model leans more towards the political side, so it's not trying to get rid of religious influence altogether.
I see. So there's still that tension. Our sources talk about the Lemon Test as a way to make sure the government isn't, overstepping its boundaries.
Ah, the Lemon Test, a classic example of how the law tries to navigate this complexity. To put it simply, it asks, does a government action have a secular purpose? Does it avoid promoting or hindering religion? And does it avoid excessive entanglement with religious institutions?
So it's kind of like drawing those lines in the sand you're talking about.
Exactly. It tries to. But of course, it's not always clear cut. Think of it like this.
Hmm.
If a public school wants to put up a holiday display, the Lemon Test helps ensure it doesn't favor one religion over another. You've probably seen that play out in your own community.
Yeah, that makes sense. But our next set of sources, they're not so sure about this whole neutrality thing.
Really?
Yeah, they're not convinced it's actually a good idea. Like, is it even possible to be truly neutral? And even if it is, does aiming for neutrality actually end up silencing religious voices, even if that wasn't the intention?
Those are some really challenging questions. They challenge the very idea of neutrality.
Exactly. They suggest that by trying to create a neutral public square, we might actually be pushing religion to the margins. One source even asks, can state neutrality itself become a kind of unofficial religion with its own set of beliefs that it quietly promotes?
Whoa. Wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty thought-provoking. So are these new arguments, or have these kinds of debates been going on for a while?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, these debates have actually been going on for centuries. The reflections of long-standing arguments about the nature of belief, individual conscience, and the limits of government. What's different now, I think, is the context. Societies are more diverse than ever, with a wider range of religious and non-religious viewpoints. So these questions are even more pressing today.
Yeah, makes sense. It's not just a theoretical debate either. Our sources get into how this neutrality idea affects the actual relationship between churches and states in the real world, like with real-world examples.
Oh, absolutely. They highlight how the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted this principle and how its rulings have impacted things like religious displays on public property and government funding for faith-based initiatives, like really practical stuff.
Yeah. So there's this constant tension, it seems, between wanting to be neutral in theory and the messiness of actually governing diverse populations.
Exactly. That's something the sources really hit on. It's an ongoing balancing act with lots of gray areas and tough calls to make. We see this play out in the news all the time. Debates about religious exemptions to laws, conflicts over religious expression in schools, and so on.
It's kind of wild to think about, right? Something seemingly small, like a holiday display or a school prayer, can become this huge flashpoint for these much bigger questions about religion's place in society.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about the legal technicalities. It's about how we understand religious freedom and what it means to live in a society with so many different beliefs all coexisting.
So speaking of diverse societies, this isn't just a U.S. issue, right? Our sources talk about a whole range of approaches to religion and government around the world.
Yeah, it's amazing. The range is pretty remarkable. It shows there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Each country's approach comes from its own history, cultural values, and political dynamics.
It's like a global tapestry. Let's take France, for example. They have this very strict idea called laïcité, which essentially means separating church and state. No religious symbols in public schools. Religion is kept out of public life as much as possible. But wait, they also fund some religious stuff. How does that work?
Right. It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? But it reflects this complex history. France's strict secularism is rooted in a history of conflict between the Catholic Church and the state. But even with laïcité, the French government still funds some religious activities, particularly in regions with long-standing ties to specific religions.
So it's not as black and white as it might seem at first glance.
Exactly. And then there's Spain, which promotes something called positive secularism.
Positive secularism, what is that?
Well, instead of just separating church and state, it goes a step further. It's about acknowledging religion's role in society and actually encouraging cooperation between religious groups and the government, for the common good.
So a more collaborative approach.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the UK, where they have an established church.
Yeah, an established church. How does that work in a modern democracy?
It's a fascinating case study. The UK shows us that having an established church doesn't automatically mean there's no religious freedom for other faiths. While the Church of England has a special status, other religions are also recognized and protected. Of course, this leads to debates about influence, but it's a dynamic situation.
It really is. So we have strict separation, active cooperation, and an established church. What a mix.
And there are even more examples. We've got Canada, where some provinces provide public funding for religious schools. You'd never see that in the U.S. Then there's Mexico, which has super strict separation, especially in education. And the European Union adds yet another layer, encouraging dialogue between governments and religious groups. It's a real mix-and-match approach.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So much variety.
It is. It shows just how much these questions about religious freedom and secular governance matter around the world. There's no single right answer. Yeah. But these different approaches, they have real-world consequences for how people experience their faith and how they interact with their governments. It's not just theoretical.
That's such an important point. So we're not trying to find the right answer here.
Right. It's more about understanding how complex this issue is, appreciating all the different approaches, and realizing that this conversation about religious freedom and secular governance is always evolving as societies change.
That's a great point. So much to think about already. Something our sources mentioned that really struck me was this idea that striving for neutrality can sometimes backfire. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, absolutely. There's a risk that when we try to create a neutral public square, we might actually unintentionally create a space that's hostile or indifferent to religion. Like, if we're not careful, the pursuit of neutrality can become its own kind of dogma, leading to a subtle but pervasive intolerance of religious belief and expression.
It's like we're trying to walk this tightrope where religion isn't dominating the public sphere, but it's not being completely shut out either.
Exactly. And that sweet spot, it's going to look different in different places, right?
Yeah.
It all depends on a society's unique history, values, and how diverse the religious landscape is.
Which makes me think about something else our sources brought up. How do we even define religion in the first place? That seems like a pretty big challenge in all of this.
Oh, it's a huge challenge. Our sources pointed out how this whole neutrality thing can lead to governments constantly trying to draw those lines in the sand. What's religious enough to be protected? What crosses the line into too religious for a secular government?
So, like, the government gets to decide what counts as religion. That seems tricky, to say the least.
It is incredibly tricky. It becomes this constant back and forth. For example, is yoga a religious practice or a secular exercise routine? Is wearing a headscarf a religious obligation or a cultural expression? Those distinctions really matter because they impact how much protection and accommodation people can expect.
That makes sense. And I imagine that could have a real impact on how religious communities see themselves in society. Do they feel like they're valued participants in the public square, or do they constantly have to fight for recognition?
That's a really crucial point, and some of our sources suggest that an overly strict focus on neutrality can actually weaken religious communities. If they're always being told to leave their beliefs at the door when they enter the public sphere, it can lead to a sense of alienation.
So it's not about silencing religious voices altogether. It's about finding ways for those voices to be heard and respected, without, of course, endorsing one religion over another or imposing beliefs on people who don't share them.
Precisely. It's about striking that delicate balance. We need to respect the role of religion in public life without undermining those core principles of a secular government.
So we've seen these different approaches, France with laïcité, Spain with positive secularism, and even the UK with an established church. Are there any common threads running through these approaches, or are they all just totally unique?
It's really interesting to compare them. While each country's approach is shaped by its own history, you can definitely see some broader themes emerging. For example, many Western democracies are grappling with how to accommodate increasingly diverse religious populations within systems that were, frankly, initially designed for more homogeneous societies.
So how do they manage that? How do you balance the religious freedoms of, say, a growing Muslim population with the historically Christian identity of a country like France or the UK?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers. Some countries, like Canada, have adopted a more multicultural approach, embracing that diversity and making accommodations. Others, like France, have doubled down on their commitment to secularism, arguing that strict neutrality is the best way to ensure equality and prevent social fragmentation.
So it's this tension between embracing pluralism and maintaining a shared identity. What do you think about that?
It's a fundamental tension, and how societies navigate it is going to have a huge impact on the future of religious freedom and intercultural dialogue. It's a constant balancing act, and we're seeing it play out in different ways all over the world.
You know, what strikes me after hearing all these examples is that this concept of secular governance is not one size fits all. It can look totally different depending on where you are and the specific historical and cultural factors at play.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder that there's no single solution to the challenge of balancing religious freedom with a neutral government.
Mhm.
Each society has to find its own path, and those approaches will continue to evolve as societies themselves change.
It's a lot to think about, and honestly, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have, but even just scratching the surface, we've uncovered some really profound questions. And that's what these deep dives are all about, right? It's not about giving you easy answers, but about sparking your curiosity and encouraging you to engage with these complex issues.
Speaking of complex issues, our sources brought up this idea that striving for neutrality can sometimes backfire in unexpected ways.
Right. There's a risk that by trying so hard to create a neutral public square, we might actually end up creating a space that's hostile or even indifferent to religion. If we're not careful, that pursuit of neutrality can become a kind of dogma in itself, leading to a subtle but very real intolerance of religious belief and expression.
So it's like by trying to be neutral, we could actually be creating more problems.
It's a real possibility. Some argue that when you silence religious voices or push them to the margins, it can actually create a breeding ground for more extreme forms of religious expression. If people feel like their beliefs aren't being heard or respected within mainstream society, they might be more likely to turn to more radical, even violent outlets.
So it's not as simple as saying, okay, everyone, keep your religion private. There are these broader societal implications we have to think about.
Exactly. It's not just about protecting individual religious freedom, it's also about understanding how religion can play a role in society as a whole.
We've covered so much in this deep dive: legal frameworks, philosophical arguments, historical context, real-world examples. It feels like we keep circling back to this fundamental question: what is the right place for religion in a modern, diverse world?
That's the core of it, isn't it? And each society has to wrestle with that question through dialogue, debate, and even trial and error. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. But I think by engaging in these conversations, even when they're difficult, we can try to create societies that respect individual beliefs while also working towards the common good.
So what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with today? After all this, what do you really want to stick with them?
Well, first, I hope it's clear that this whole idea of secular governance, it's a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance. It means different things to different people and plays out differently depending on the context.
And second,
That this balance between religious freedom and state neutrality, it's a moving target. It's always evolving. There will always be new challenges, new perspectives, and that requires societies to constantly adapt and reevaluate their approach.
makes sense. Anything else?
Finally, and maybe most importantly, there is no single right answer. Each society has to figure out its own path. And I think the most effective solutions, they often come from open and honest dialogue.
Well said. This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of just how complex this issue really is.
It's been a pleasure discussing all of this with you. And I hope our listeners have gained some insights too, maybe even sparked some of their own questions.
Absolutely. So, to our listeners out there, if you were designing a country's approach to religious freedom, what would be your top priorities? What would you focus on? This deep dive is a great starting point, but I encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging. There's a whole world out there grappling with these same questions. Every country has its own story to tell, and there are so many valuable lessons to be learned. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those wheels turning.
Couldn't agree more. This conversation about religious freedom and secular governance, it's an ongoing one, and it's one we should all be a part of.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.